How do you solve a murder when the victim and the killer have the same fingerprints? I've been a commander for over 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything until this case landed on my desk last week. It started as what seemed like a routine homicide call at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the kind of night where the city feels dead and every sound echoes louder than it should be. I got the call from dispatch telling me there was a body found in an abandoned warehouse on the east side of town. Nothing unusual about that, really. We get calls like this maybe once or twice a month in that area, but what made this different was what the responding officers found when they got there. The victim was a man in his early 40s lying face down in a pool of blood with multiple stab wounds to the back and neck. The scene was brutal, but not uncommon for that part of town. What caught everyone's attention, though, was the wallet found next to the body. It contained an ID for someone named Marcus Reed, age 43, from downtown. But when we ran his fingerprints through the system, something impossible came up. The prints matched not only Marcus Reed, but also someone named David Chin, same age, same physical description, but completely different background. Reed was supposedly a construction worker with a clean record, not even a parking ticket, while Chun was a small-time criminal with multiple arrests for theft, fraud, and even assault. I remember standing there in that warehouse at 3 a.m. staring at this corpse, trying to wrap my head around what my officers were telling me. I've seen identity theft before, fake IDs, stolen social security numbers, but this was different. This wasn't some criminal using someone else's information. This was two completely legitimate identities with matching biometric data, which should have been impossible. I remember standing in the morgue the next morning staring at this corpse, trying to make sense of what the lab had told me. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Coleman, was just as confused as I was. She'd been doing this job for 15 years and had never seen anything like it. We took the prints again, thinking maybe there was contamination or some kind of mix-up in the lab. But the results came back identical, every single ridge. And World matched both identities perfectly. It was like this dead man had lived two completely separate lives. The investigation became my obsession. When we went to Marcus Reed's apartment, we found exactly what you'd expect from a construction worker: work boots covered in dried concrete by the door, hard hat hanging on a hook in the kitchen counter, photos of him with his crew at various job sites around the city. His neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, the kind of guy who kept to himself, but always said hello. His landlord said he'd never been late on rent in 3 years. But David Chin's address told a completely different story. Upscale apartment in the financial district, designer clothes, filling an expensive walk-in closet, imported furniture that probably cost more than Reed made in a year, photos of him at high-end restaurants, exclusive nightclubs, rubbing shoulders with people who looked like they had serious money. His neighbors barely knew him, said he came and went at odd hours, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a time. My partner, Detective Lisa Martinez, and I spend days trying to figure out how someone could have two legitimate identities with matching biometric data. We contacted the DMV, the Social Security Administration, even the FBI database, but everything checked out. Both Marcus Reed and David Chun were real people with real histories dating back decades: birth certificate, school records, employment history. Everything was there, and everything was legitimate. The more we dug, the stranger it got. Reed had been working construction for the same company for 8 years. His boss said he was reliable, showed up on time, never caused problems. But Chun had no steady employment history, just sporadic consulting work that paid extremely well according to his tax returns. The amounts didn't make sense for the vague business descriptions listed. The breakthrough came when we found Chin's burner phone hidden in a safety deposit box under yet another name, Thomas Walsh. This phone contained text messages from someone calling themselves a handler. The messages were cryptic, but clearly indicated that whoever this person was had been working for some kind of organization. The texts went back months with references to jobs, assignments, and payments. The last few messages were particularly disturbing. The handler was demanding that Chun complete one final job and threatening serious consequences if he refused. I spent countless hours going through those messages trying to decode what they meant. There were references to packages, deliveries, drops, and something called the termination protocol. One message from 2 weeks before the murder said the heat is getting too close, you need to disappear for a while. Another from a week later warned them about loose ends that needed to be tied up. The final message, sent just hours before the murder, simply said, too much time to clean up loose ends. It was signed with just the letter H. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a simple murder case. This was something much bigger and more dangerous than I'd initially thought. Someone had killed this man because he knew too much about whatever organization he'd been working for. But the question remained, who was he really? Marcus Reed, the construction worker, or David Chun, the criminal? And how had he managed to maintain both identities for so long? The answer came when we found a hidden compartment behind a false wall in Chin's expensive apartment. Inside were documents that revealed the truth. Marcus Reed and David Chun were both cover identities created by a classified government program that had been disbanded years ago. The real person was someone named Agent Thomas Mitchell, no relation to me despite sharing my last name, who had been working deep undercover infiltrating criminal organizations for over a decade. According to the classified files, Agent Mitchell had been recruited straight out of college by a program that created deep cover operatives. They gave him the Marcus Reed identity to maintain a normal appearing life, while using the David Chun identity to get close to criminal networks and gather intelligence. He'd been feeding information back to his handlers for years, helping to break up drug rings, money laundering operations, and human trafficking networks. But something had gone wrong. The program, called Project Mirror, had been shut down 3 years ago due to budget cuts and ethical concerns about the psychological impact on operatives living double lives. But Mitchell had continued operating on his own, possibly selling the information he gathered to the highest bidder, or maybe he'd just gotten too deep and couldn't find his way out. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a murder case, it was the elimination of a rogue agent who'd become a liability. But if that was true, then whoever killed him was still out there. And they knew I was investigating. Reading through more of the hidden files, I found references to other agents, other double identities, and evidence that Project Mirror had been much larger than anyone realized. The files contain names, addresses, photos of people living completely fabricated lives. Some had been terminated when the program shut down, others had simply vanished, and a few, like Mitchell, had gone rogue. The scope of it was staggering. Dozens of people with multiple identities living among us, completely invisible to normal law enforcement. That night, I made a decision that probably wasn't the smartest thing I'd ever done. Instead of calling in federal authorities or requesting backup, I decided to follow up on one of the leads from Chin's phone. There was an address mentioned in several messages, a storage facility on the outskirts of town where packages were supposed to be delivered, I figured if I could find evidence of this larger organization, I could wrap up the case. And maybe even uncover how many other agents were still out there. The storage facility was exactly what you'd expect from a place trying to stay under the radar. Old, run-down buildings with minimal lighting and security cameras that looked like they hadn't worked in years. I used the access code from Chen's phone to get inside Unit 47, and what I found there made my blood run cold. The unit was filled with surveillance equipment, fake IDs, weapons, and most disturbing of all, photos of me and my family taken over the past several weeks. Someone had been watching me since I'd started investigating this case. There were photos of me leaving the police station, getting coffee at my usual spot, even pictures of my house with my wife's car in the driveway. As I stood there looking at photos of my daughter walking to school and my wife grocery shopping, I realized I'd walked into something much more dangerous than I'd imagined. These people weren't just criminals, they were professionals with resources and connections, and they've been monitoring my every move probably since the moment I'd taken the case. I grabbed as much evidence as I could carry, stuffing fake passports, weapons, and surveillance equipment into evidence bags, and got out of there as fast as possible. My hand was shaking as I drove back to the station, knowing that every car behind me could be following me, every shadow could be hiding someone watching. Back at the station, I tried to process everything I'd learned. Agent Mitchell had been killed because he knew too much about Project Mirror, but now I knew too much as well, and whoever was behind this conspiracy had been watching me the whole time. I considered calling in federal backup, but then I remembered something from the files. Mitchell had tried to go to the authorities before his death, and look what happened to him. I spent the rest of that night going through every piece of evidence, trying to figure out who else might be involved. The surveillance photos showed professional quality work, expensive equipment. This wasn't some amateur operation. Whoever was running this had serious resources and connections, possibly even people inside law enforcement. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my office door. It was simple and to the point: stop digging or you'll end up like Mitchell. There was no signature, but attached to the note was a photo of my family at dinner the night before, taken through our kitchen window from what looked like our neighbor's yard. The message was clear: back off or face the consequences. But I couldn't back off, not when I was this close to solving the case, and not when innocent people might still be in danger. I decided to set a trap using the burner phone I'd found. I sent a message to the handler claiming to be Mitchell and saying I had information they needed. I suggested meeting at the same warehouse where Mitchell's body had been found, figuring they might feel confident returning to a place they'd already used. That night, I positioned myself in the warehouse with backup unit stationed nearby, but out of sight. I'd brief them on the situation without revealing all the classified details. I discovered just enough to make sure they knew this was serious. I waited for over an hour in that cold, empty building, listening to every sound, wondering if anyone would actually show up. When they finally did arrive, it wasn't what I expected. Instead of some shadowy government operative or professional assassin, it was Dr. Sarah Coleman, the medical examiner who'd been working on Mitchell's case from the beginning. She walked into the warehouse, carrying a briefcase and looking around nervously like she wasn't sure what she was walking into. When she saw me standing there, her face went completely pale, and I knew immediately that I'd found my killer. She tried to run, but my backup units were already in position We had her surrounded within seconds. She didn't even try to fight, just stood there looking defeated like she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. During her interrogation, she revealed the truth about Project Mirror and her role in Mitchell's death. It turned out that Coleman had been Mitchell's handler the whole time. She'd been using her position as medical examiner to help create and maintain false identities for various agents. When someone with a cover identity died, she could manipulate the autopsy reports, fingerprint records, even DNA evidence to maintain their secrets.